Mr. Bastani will say the opening prayer.
O God, refresh and gladden my spirit, purify my heart, illumine my powers. I lay all my affairs in thy hand. Thou art my guide and my refuge. I will no longer be sorrowful and grieve. I will be a happy and joyful being. O God, I will no longer be full of anxiety, nor will I let trouble harass me. I will not dwell on the unpleasant things of life. O God, thou art more friend to me than I am to myself. I dedicate myself to thee, O Lord.
Thank you, Mr. Bastani. Friends, it's wonderful and delightful to have Mike McMullen as a speaker today. Mike and I have been friends for seems like forever, but we have been friends at least 25 years. So,
Yeah.
Mike McMullen is a professor of sociology and cross-cultural studies at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. He has a PhD from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Mike is the author of several books, including The Baha'is, The Religious Construction of a Global Identity, which was published by Rutgers University Press in 2000. The Baha'is of America, The Growth and Change of a Religious Movement by New York University Press in 2015. And Introducing America with Tariq Hussein in 2018. Mike is currently working on a book on the history of conflict resolution in the United States. His area of interest includes the sociology of religion, the Middle East, organizational development, and the change in conflict resolution and mediation. Mike has worked for 5 years as a researcher and workshop facilitator at the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta, Georgia. Mike McMullen has also spent a year in Egypt as a Fulbright scholar. Mike has presented his research to the Baha'i National Assembly, and he's made presentations at the Wilmette Institute, which I think many of us have actually heard that presentation. But most recently, Mike spent a summer teaching at the United States International University of Africa in Nairobi, Kenya. In 2019, Dr. McMullen is also very involved with the Interfaith community in Houston. I know that he worked on the Interfaith Relations Committee for Interfaith Ministries of Greater Houston when I was on that group. Mike lives in, as you know, in Clear Lake area of Houston, with his wife and two beautiful young daughters. And so really, I'm excited that Mike has agreed to do this for us, and I'm going to turn it over to Mike McMullen. Dr. McMullen, sir, it's yours.
Well, thank you, Ajit. It's an honor to be here. I hear lots of great things and have attended several of the Austin, these firesides or deepenings or gatherings. So it's an honor to be here. I appreciate you inviting me. And welcome to everyone. Ajit said I have about an hour, and so I'll talk for a while, and then we can open it up to questions. This might be a little bit different kind of gathering than what we've had before through the Austin community. As Ajit said, I'm a sociologist. I have been studying the Baha'i faith for 25 years or so, and let me share my screen. I forgot to do that. And so let's see. So hopefully you can see the slides there on the screen. I've got involved in what's called the FACT project. FACT stands for Faith Communities Today. It's out of Hartford Seminary in Hartford, Connecticut. And it's a consortium of a bunch of social scientists who study religion. So it involves the Methodists and the Mormons and the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the Catholics, but also non-Christian faiths as well. The Baha'i faith, various Jewish denominations, Muslims are involved, Hindus are involved. We haven't yet been able to find a Buddhist researcher to participate. So if anyone knows of a Buddhist researcher that could participate and help us out, that would be great. But it's the longest running interfaith research project in the United States and probably the world. I got involved because Rob Stockman, who runs the Wilmette Institute, he knew I was a sociologist and I collect data and I do surveys and I study the Baha'i faith. So he got me involved in the late 1990s. And as you can see on the screen there, the first national survey was done in 2000. And then we've done them in 2005, 2008, 2010, 2015, and the most recent one in 2020. And the Baha'is have been involved this whole time, which is great from my perspective as a Baha'i, because the Baha'is have been at the table in this longest running interfaith research project. So it kind of gives us, as we emerge from obscurity, it gives us some cachet since we've been involved that long.
Hey, Mike, can I interrupt real quick?
Sure.
The slide, we see it, but we see it in a like presenters mode, so you can see the next slide and the current slide sort of side by side.
And how do I get it out of that?
I think there's a
Display.
perhaps the three buttons down there. It may be that you're in a different screen of yours that you need to share, not this particular one.
Okay. Let's see.
If you try to unshare and then share again.
Okay. How's that?
Perfect.
Is that now there's just one slide on the screen?
Correct.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. And then a little bit more about FACT, and then we'll get into some Baha'i findings. I'll talk mostly about the 2020 survey, which we completed recently, but I'll compare it to some other surveys, and I'll also compare it to just what's going on in religion in the United States. So we'll be talking about the Baha'i faith throughout this hour, but we'll also be kind of putting the Baha'is in a context of what's happening in the religious landscape of the United States. So as I said, it's the largest interfaith survey of religious congregations in the US. There were nearly 20,000 different churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples involved in the 2020 survey. So it represents over 90% of religious representation in the United States. So it's a pretty widespread and comprehensive survey. So the 2020 data that I'll talk mostly about here was collected between January and February of 2020. So it was right before the pandemic shutdown. So right after we got the data, the COVID pandemic hit. So that changed how religion operated or religion functioned in the United States. We had 404 responses to the Baha'i survey. And the Baha'is, of course, were a little different than other religious groups. Most religious groups, the survey was sent to the clergy person, the head clergy person. So it was a priest, a minister, a rabbi, an imam. Of course, in the Baha'i faith, we don't have clergy. So the survey was sent to the secretary of the local spiritual assembly. So out of the 950 local spiritual assemblies that received the survey, about 404 returned it. So a 42.5% response rate, which may not sound great, but for online surveys, that's actually pretty good. Lots of online surveys now are getting 5 or 10%, so we got 42%. So for an online survey, that was pretty good. I sent 2 reminder emails to try to boost response rates, and that worked pretty well to increase response rates. So I'm going to cover 6 or 7 areas of religious life in the survey and talk about the Baha'is: worship, leadership, participants or community members, mission and identity of the community, and programs and finances. And finally, looking that we had special modules. Every survey has some special questions. And so we asked questions about youth participation and interfaith activity. So I'll talk more about those. And I might just add too, as you can imagine, there were many times that I had to revise the survey questions. We had a core set of questions that every religious group asked, but I had to revise them for the Baha'i context. So, for example, if every religious group wanted to know about their clergy, and of course we don't have clergy in the Baha'i faith, so I asked about local spiritual assembly membership. So I had to, and then most religious groups meet weekly for their primary worship activity on a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. I asked about attendance at the 19-day feast, which is the Baha'i primary worship experience. So a lot of the questions had to be modified quite a bit to fit into the Baha'i context, which was fine, but it meant that sometimes it's hard to compare Baha'is with other groups, but we'll do some of that comparison. So the first section was about worship, and I'm not going to include all the questions or all the data that we got from the survey. If you want to have a full report, send me an email at the end or in the next few days or something, and I can send you a full report that I've written about the 2020 survey. The average year of founding for Baha'i communities was 1971. So we are fairly young. So we're on average only about 50 years old, compared to some churches that were started in the late 1700s. So obviously that was quite different. But the average Baha'i community was established in incorporating their Baha'i community in 1971. We asked about worship attendance. So we asked about attendance at the 19-day feast. And we asked, please estimate the total average attendance at your regular 19-day feast service. In 2020, the average attendance was 18. 1 year ago, the average attendance was 17. 5 years ago, it was also 17. And then I also looked at the last several years. And as you can see, it's pretty consistent. The average Baha'i community has about 17 or 18 people at their regular feast. And I thought, well, that seems kind of low, but if you think about the average Baha'i community in the United States, there's the average Baha'i community has about 25 members. The average church has about 80 members. So even though, so just to kind of provide a comparison, so even though what we call mega churches get a lot of attention today in the press and the popular press and in academic research, the vast majority of Americans go to small churches. There's been a growth of mega churches in the last 15 or 20 years, but most people attend churches with only about 80 members. And so average church attendance is around 40 to 50. So Baha'is are less than that, but given our size, it's not too far behind. What I found really interesting about this data is that Baha'i attendance at feast has been consistent, very consistent, maybe frustratingly consistent because it hasn't gone up. But what our fact data has found, that since our first survey in the year 2000, church attendance has been cut in half. Church attendance back in 2000 was around 160 people attended on an average Sunday. Now it's down to less than 80. So this this reflects the fact that people who kind of pay attention to what's going on in religion in the United States recognize that people are becoming more secular or less religious or less interested in religion, especially millennials. We'll talk more about youth here in a second. But there is the fastest growing group of religious people in the United States are people who are not religious at all. What we in the sociology business call nones, N-O-N-E-S, people who say, I don't have any religious affiliation. I didn't grow up with religion. I'm not interested in religion. I don't identify with religion. And that's about 25 or 30% of the American population has no affiliation, no interest, no membership. So that's a lot of where the decline in membership is being driven by the fact that the younger generation is not interested. It's not that older people have stopped going, they keep going, but it's the younger people haven't started to go. So the fact that the Baha'is have remained consistent, we've been flat in 19-day feast attendance, is actually somewhat encouraging, you could say. You could look at it that way, given that church, and when I say church, I also mean church, synagogue, and mosque attendance, all has fallen by 50%. So that's, I found that quite interesting. I asked several questions, or we asked in our survey several questions about worship. I'm not going to go through every little sub question here. Just a couple things to note. We asked the whole fact survey. So this is everybody asking, all the religious groups, about does your worship experience include electric guitar? That might seem kind of strange, but what that's trying to pick up or measure is, does your worship service, has it become more contemporary? Does it have contemporary music? And what our research has found is that unless you have switched to contemporary music, your attendance has dropped off even further. So the only churches that are growing are the ones that have introduced this kind of contemporary worship experience, where it's less formal. The church I grew up in before I became a Baha'i, we had an organ or a piano. That's a more traditional service. A contemporary worship experience has a band that plays contemporary Christian music for the most part. So that's why that question about electric guitar is in there. As you can see, that does not describe Baha'i communities at all, almost not at all. But that question was asked because we're trying to measure, have churches adopted a more contemporary worship experience? We do see when it asks about recorded music, about almost 58% of Baha'i communities said that described them well or very well. And so this was the 2020 data. The number of Baha'i communities that have included recorded music has gone from about 20% to 58% over those 20 years. So I think that reflects the emphasis that the National Spiritual Assembly has given to making feast more welcoming and interesting and spiritually enlivening. And more communities have added recorded music as a result. About 32%, 33% include children reading or performing. that describes them well or very well for the Baha'i communities. About 25%, about a fourth, say that they have youth reading or performing as part of their worship 19-day worship experience. So, and those numbers have risen pretty dramatically, including children in the feast and including youth in the feast. So the numbers are still not really great, but they're much higher than they were back in 2000. I'll go on. If you have any questions, you can ask that later. Over the last year, how many times has your community held feast? This was a question from the 2010 survey. We didn't ask that question in the 2020 survey, but I thought it was interesting because 85% of Baha'i communities in the United States have all 19 feasts. And again, this was before the pandemic, so that may have changed as a result of pandemic shutdowns and so forth. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But most Baha'i communities have all their feasts. We asked about change in worship style, and this was across the board: Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Baha'i, etc. About 41% of Baha'i communities said they hadn't changed their style much, but a third have. And I think part of that style change is they've added music. They've added maybe some drama or skits. So again, there's been an emphasis to try to make the feast more spiritually engaging. So then we asked about leadership. And again, as I said, for most faith groups, this meant asking about clergy. We don't have clergy in the Baha'i faith. We have elected assemblies, local spiritual assemblies. And so I looked at what's the median participation or characteristics of the 9 local spiritual assembly members. And when it comes to gender, the typical Baha'i community had 5 women on the LSA and 4 men. So quite a bit of gender equality there. We tended to be a little bit older. 6 out of the 9 members were 45 years or older. So fewer youth or young adults. So most of our assembly members are over 45, so the majority are. When we asked about education, let's see. Yeah, education, 7 of the 9 assembly members had a bachelor's degree or more education. And we found that to be true, that the Baha'i community in general tends to be well educated. And the leadership was also well educated. There does seem to be a considerable amount of racial unity or racial diversity represented among the 9 assembly members. So the median ethnic background was quite diverse. The majority are white, but there's quite a bit of ethnic diversity there as well. We asked, how many times did your local assembly meet this past year? This was a question from 2010, and the average was 17.1 times. So almost once every Baha'i month. How many of your LSA members were on the assembly 5 years ago? And a little over 5 were. We asked that question because we wanted to see, is there any turnover, or is the same 9 people always on? And turns out there is some turnover. How many times in the last year did your local spiritual assembly meet with an auxiliary board member? And the average was a little over once a year. So then we asked about participants. So how many persons, including children, regularly participate in worship or other religious activities in your community? So the average was 31. The median is 15, because you do have some large Baha'i communities, Houston, LA, Chicago, New York, etc., that pull the average up. But the typical Baha'i community is fairly small. And then we asked about how many children, how many youth, how many young adults, how many middle adults, etc. So again, Baha'i communities are small. We tend to have older members, and so it will be interesting to see over the next 15 or 20 years if we're able to keep our kids involved and keep them involved in LSA life, so that they become contributing adults. This may be one of the more important statistics we found from the FACT survey. FACT research shows that 53% of Baha'i communities can be defined as multiracial. So in the social sciences, the common definition is that if at least 20% of a organization is of a non-majority ethnic group, then we consider that organization multiracial or multi-ethnic. So if it's yeah.
When you say multiracial, where are you including the Persians?
That's a great idea. That's a great question. The U.S. Census considers Persians white, for good or bad, right? So when I asked the question, I asked about Persians separately, and if they're included as white or a separate category. If you define Persian as some other as an ethnic group different from a racial group, which it obviously is, then the number of Baha'i communities that are multiracial or multi-ethnic goes up. It's more than 53%. But I was just looking at kind of how does the census define these communities. So if more than 20% of your church, for example, if it's a mostly white church, but at least 20% are Hispanic or African American or some combination of that, then that would be considered multi-ethnic or multiracial. So the most churches, 5% of churches in the United States would be considered multiracial, which means that only 5% of churches have more than 20% of some ethnic minority. So it might be, again, a majority white church with 20% African American, or it might be a majority Hispanic church with 20% white. Only 5% of churches are multiracial. If you include mosques and synagogues in that, only 7% of religious organizations are multi-ethnic or multiracial. But 53% of Baha'i communities are multiracial.
And so did you say that 53% does not include Persians?
Right. If you include Persian, I'm using what the Census Bureau defines Persians as racially as white.
Yeah.
I didn't create that definition, but that's how they define it. But if you include Persians as another ethnic community, part of the multi-ethnic community of Baha'is, then that number goes up considerably. So I'm the 53% is a conservative estimate, you might say.
That's very good.
So that's a tremendous amount of diversity in the Baha'i community. To have over half of our communities are multi-ethnic, whereas only 5% of churches are. Martin Luther King famously said that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in Christian America. And that's the research has shown. There's a guy named Michael Emerson at Rice University has found that that is still true today. He's the one who came up with this 5% number. So Baha'is have, we can talk more about this later, but to me, this is, Baha'is stand for racial unity and the unity of humanity. And this number seems to reflect that importance. Then we asked some more questions about participants. About half of regularly participating adults are female. This is slightly different from famously churches are between 60 and 65% female. So most participants in churches are female. In our survey, in the Baha'i survey, it's about half and half. Again, 38% are college graduates. Only 3.7% live below the poverty level. So Baha'is are relatively well off on the socioeconomic scale. That's in part because Baha'is tend to have higher levels of education than the average American. And then I found consistently throughout all the time I've been doing research on the American Baha'i community, about 70% of Baha'is are converts. Only about 30% have been lifelong Baha'is. A lot of that are Persians. Not all lifelong Baha'is are Persians, but we're a heavy. Our religious group is a lot of converts who converted to the Baha'i faith. Then when we look at mission and identity, I won't go through all these numbers here, but when we just kind of look at some of these numbers, Baha'is look very similar to most of the religious landscape in the United States. Most Baha'i communities, most Baha'i respondents agree or strongly agree that we have a strong mission and purpose. Most churches said that too, in synagogues and mosques. 76% of us, or almost 77%, said that we are striving to be diverse. They either agree or strongly agree with that statement. 75% agree or strongly agree that we're trying to be, that we are spiritually alive and vital. 61% agree or strongly agree that we're active in our local community. And then another 72% said that agree or strongly agree that we're actively looking for new members. So this is not too different from the majority of religious groups in the United States. Most churches, most synagogues, most mosques also say the same kind of thing about their communities. Just in the interest of time, I'm probably going to skip this slide. We didn't ask this question on the 2020 survey, but I thought this was interesting, so I included it from the 2010 survey. How would you describe the theological outlook of the majority of your regularly participating adults? Now, this question was asked to try to gauge is the church, and most of the participants of the FACT Research Consortium are Christian groups and Christian researchers. They wanted to see, has there been a change over time in more members becoming more conservative or becoming more liberal? And what Baha'is were unique is that almost 2/3 said, well, we're moderate. A few said we're somewhat more liberal. A few said that we're somewhat more conservative. But most Baha'i communities said we're moderate. And what I think that reflects is that the Baha'i community, because we don't get involved in some of the political debates that churches have been pulled into, that we're not swayed by some of those kinds of liberal or conservative political issues. Whereas most churches have become much more polarized over the last 20 or 30 years. It used to be you had a nearly 50-50 split in almost every denomination. Half the members of the Catholic community were conservative, half were liberal. Half the members of the Presbyterians were liberal, half were conservative. Now the churches have become much more polarized, and the Baha'is have not. At least that's how I would be reading some of this data. In fact, again, several questions about politics were asked in the 2020 survey. In the last 12 months, has your community organized any groups, meetings, classes, or events specifically focused on the following purposes or activities to discuss politics, to get people registered to vote, to lobby elected officials, et cetera, et cetera? As you can see, the vast majority of Baha'is have not gotten involved in any of that, which is kind of what I would have expected. But it was interesting that 90+% of Baha'i communities say we don't get involved in that, which is kind of part of our ideology, that Baha'is are not to engage in partisan politics. So this question was asked specifically to see where churches were heading, and Baha'is tend to not get involved. Then we asked a series of questions about programs. I'm not going to go through all of these fine points here. Baha'is tend to when we do get involved, or when we do promote programs, they tend to be of an educational nature. The next slide really kind of shows this, that I asked specifically, and this was not in the core fact set of questions. I asked this separately because I wanted to find out about the core activities that Baha'is have been focusing on since 1996. And as you can see, when I asked about deepenings, 80% either emphasize this some or give a lot of emphasis to deepenings. 97% give some or a lot of emphasis to devotionals. 60% give some or a lot of emphasis to children's classes. 55% give some or a lot of emphasis to junior youth. And 90% give some or a lot of emphasis to Ruhi classes. And all of those numbers have increased since 2000. So over the last 20 years that Baha'is have been involved in the FACT survey, we've seen these numbers increase. More emphasis and more focus given to the core activities: devotionals, children's classes, junior youth classes, and Ruhi classes.
Sorry, Mike, I have a quick question.
Sure.
The in this one, there's one of them that stands out from all the others in terms of the responses, and that's the first one. Can you explain what that one is about?
Right. That was asked, and again, I sometimes I included questions because everybody else was asking them too. This was asked because several churches wanted to find out, are there efforts to have multicultural multicultural programming, or to recognize that more families are multicultural and provide some kind of support for them. So it's mostly asked to try to get a handle on what if anything churches are doing to try to support that. Baha'is give a little bit of emphasis to that, but not very much. But it turned out most churches and synagogues and temples and mosques don't give much emphasis to it either. But this was that question was asked for the first time in 2020, and so it'll be assuming FACT continues over the next 5 or 10 years. It'll be interesting to see if that increases as our society becomes more multicultural. Does that that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
It's if I were to design a survey just for Baha'is, I wouldn't include some of the stuff that's in there, but I wanted to ask it along with, so I could provide data to the whole FACT project. So, I wouldn't ask about, do you have guitars, electric guitars at worship? Maybe some Baha'i communities do, but that's mostly something that churches are interested in. Just in the interest of time, I think I'll skip over some of this. Just asking about kind of how much emphasis do Baha'is give to personal and family kinds of programs. We tend to support a lot of those. This question was asking, overall, to what extent are your community's active participants involved in teaching? Just real quickly, Rob Stockman at the Wilmette Institute said that he's observed teaching seems to be that Baha'i activity and teaching seems to have gone down the more we've emphasized the core activities. And so I wanted to see, well, can we measure that in any way? And so in 2010, the number of communities who said they give quite a lot or a lot of emphasis was 47.2%. And in 2020, it was 35.5%, quite a lot or a lot. So I think there's been some decline in the emphasis on teaching itself, but a lot of people would argue that the core activities themselves are mechanisms for teaching. And as you can see from an earlier slide, the vast majority of Baha'i communities are very involved in the core activities. So I'm not sure how I would assess whether we're teaching less or we're doing more core activities, which are teaching. Maybe this is more, kind of traditional teaching activities. I might try to figure out how to ask that question a little bit differently to try to parse that out. This slide I just threw in because churches and synagogues and mosques were very interested in this in terms of does your church provide social services to the community? And a lot of churches are very active. They have food pantries, they have clothing pantries, they have rental assistance and so forth. As you can see, most Baha'is said no to these kinds of social service activities, because that's kind of in some ways that's not what Baha'is have focused on. Baha'is focus more on educational things, on teaching the faith, on programming that deals with race unity or the equality of men and women, and we do much less. I just wanted to show that that seems to be borne out in some of the data. Let me look at my time here. In finances, it turns out Baha'is the Baha'i communities are not in serious financial trouble the way some religious groups are, because, and I'm speaking mostly about churches, because churches on average have lost 50% of their attendance over the last 20 years. Many of them, especially mainline churches, so like Presbyterians and Methodists and Lutherans and so forth, are having some serious financial problems. Most Baha'i communities don't say they're okay, they're doing good or excellent, but a lot of churches are having some severe problems. Evangelical or more conservative churches tend to do a little better because they have not lost quite as many attendees. That's mostly a mainline and mostly a mainline church issue, but it's affected all of the churches. So Baha'is are not in serious trouble. Of course, we haven't grown very much either, as the data shows. What was the approximate dollar amount of the community's total budget in 2020? It was about 12,500. In 2010, it was right about 18,000. So we've had a little bit of decline in contributions to the fund. So real quick, I want to leave time for questions. We asked in 2020, we had two modules about youth and about interfaith activity. I think interfaith was both 2010 and 2020. Do you have readings or performances by children at or youth at feast? And about 30% said sometimes. So again, there's been an increase in the number of youth and children involved in the 19-day feast, but we have room for improvement on that. Do you have programs for young adults? And 60% of the community said no. And it turned out most churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques also a lot of emphasis on children, a lot of emphasis on elderly, but not so much about young adults. And Baha'is are kind of in the same boat. We could have improvements for young adults as well. Very few give a lot of emphasis to programs for young adults. Programs for youth, a little bit more, although almost half said none for youth as well. So we could have improvement there. How high a priority is it to engage young adults in the community? The median answer for Baha'is was it's a priority, but others are more immediate. So again, we could have some improvement there. Of young adults who participate in the community, estimate the percent who attend the 19-day feast. So almost half do. Attendance in programs or activities other than worship, and this was mostly the core activities, about 45 or 46%. So again, Baha'is probably, I would read this by saying we should probably pay a little more attention to young adults and youth. Of young adults who participate in the community, estimate the percent, and churches were more interested in this question, but we asked it anyway. Over half are single, 5% are partnered but not married, 17% are married without children, and about 28% are married with children. So that's kind of our demographic breakdown. Has the number of young adults in your community increased or decreased? Almost half said stayed about the same, and almost an equal number, 25% said they increased, 27% said they decreased. And this was a question that was most interesting to churches because they wanted to know, do you have a young adult minister or a clergy person that focuses on young adults? So we don't have much a leader in the community who focuses on young adults, but this was an attempt to try to track it for churches. We have some volunteers though who focus on young adults, especially probably in the bigger communities. And then here's just some programs for young adults. Baha'is do the most, it looks like, for scripture classes. The actual survey said Bible study, so I changed it to scripture class or a deepening. But most Baha'i communities don't have programming specifically for young adults. And then interfaith activity. I wanted to throw this in just because Baha'is are fairly unique on this, and then I'll open it up for questions. In the past 12 months, has your community been involved in any of the following activities with other faith groups? So have you had worship services, so feasts or holy days? With other Baha'i communities, over half of the communities reported that they had a unity feast or some combination combined with other Baha'i communities. But almost 19% said they had worship with other faith traditions. Christians, Muslims, Jews, etc. That's higher than any other fact participant. So Baha'is do this more than churches, synagogues, or temples or mosques. Educational or social activities, over a third said that they do those types of things with other Baha'i communities, and almost 30% do them with non-Baha'i faith traditions. And then finally, community service activities. 21% said they did community service with other Baha'i communities, and over a third, 36%, 37%, said they did it with other faith traditions. Sorry. So all these numbers are higher than any other of the faith communities. Baha'is do more interfaith stuff, whether it's worship, educational, or community service activities, than any other religious tradition, any other faith tradition. Which is not surprising, given Baha'is recognize the unity of all religions, but it's interesting that it's borne out by this data. So during the last 3 years, have members of your LSA met regularly with clergy from other faith traditions in a small group for continuing education, interfaith dialogue, or to address community needs? And about a third said yes. So as Ajit talked about earlier, Baha'is have been involved in Interfaith Ministries of Houston. So that's kind of an interfaith group that Baha'is have been involved with for years, I think. So it depends on the size of the community where they have these available, but about a third of our communities do that. And there's just a picture of the Houston Baha'i Center where a lot of Baha'i activity in the Houston area happens. So that's looking at my time. I've got about 8 minutes for any questions or comments. Again, I know this was a little bit different kind of presentation, a lot of data, a lot of tables. Hopefully it wasn't too boring.
Yeah, I have a question, if I
Sure.
may.
Please.
Based on your survey, what would distinguish the Baha'i community from other churches and religious organizations?
Yeah, good question. I think, well, as I mentioned earlier, I think the biggest thing that distinguishes Baha'i communities is our focus on racial unity. That our communities are more multicultural, multi-ethnic than any other faith tradition, I think you could say. There are a few Christian groups, the Jehovah's Witnesses, focus a lot on intercultural recruitment, but I think Baha'is do more of that, and our data shows that our communities are more multi-ethnic.
Arastu has a question.
What?
Arastu has a question.
Yes.
He's raising his hand.
Well, I kind of had change of mind, but since you called my name, I'll just go ahead and ask.
Sure.
You know, the revolution in Iran happened about 40 years ago, and there was an influx of Persians to the Baha'i community in the United States. And the probably average age of those people who moved at that time is probably in 60s now, you know, after 40 plus years. So what kind of impact that segment of the Baha'i community in the United States has on the data that you represent?
That's a good question. When I interviewed in the past, I've interviewed, done a lot of interviews of American Baha'i community members, and when I interviewed Persians, or when I interviewed anyone, they said that the benefit of having a huge influx of Persians was that you got a sense of kind of the importance of Baha'i history and the roots of Baha'i history in Persian culture and Islamic culture, something that maybe early Baha'is in the United States didn't have that appreciation. And so I think it's the importance of Baha'i history and knowing that history.
But what changes that as that event? What kind of impact that event had on the data you presented?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Have you looked at that?
No, not specifically.
Okay.
That's a good.
Yeah.
I'm gonna write that down though. That's a good point.
Yeah. What percentage of the Baha'i community in the United States is composed of individuals? Because their children are not American Baha'is.
Right, right.
So what kind of do you know what percentage is there on that segment?
Who are born in Iran?
Yeah, born in Iran and then were adults when they came to this country,
right.
of the Baha'i community.
At
Because we
one
know
point,
that then we can probably extrapolate some of the data.
At one point I saw the number 15 to 20%.
15 to 20?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's a sizable group.
So I'm going to read you two comments from Melanie.
Okay. Yeah, I was seeing those. Yeah.
First comment is, it seems to me that we are conservative on moral issues and very liberal on social issues. So it would be hard to answer that question.
Right.
And then the second comment she makes is, I wonder if we do more service activities since we don't have our own food and clothing pantries.
I see that we help out others to do that. Yeah. I think that's a lot of the kind of service that we do. Yeah. But I think a lot of the service from some of the research I've done, we also a large emphasis on literacy programs. So we start, we don't start so many food pantries, but we start literacy programs and educational programs, and also programs about the equality of men and women and racial unity. But yeah, I agree with Mel. Where's her comment now? Yeah, Melanie, that Baha'is are, whereas many churches and church members are being pulled either to a more liberal perspective, a political perspective, or conservative. It's hard to pigeonhole Baha'is because we have fairly conservative moral beliefs, but then we have what I guess you would call more liberal or progressive social ideas about economics and racial justice and that kind of thing. I'm looking at some of the questions. Dr. Johnson, Chris Johnson says, evangelicals are not polarized politically from what I have read. For example, Southern Baptist Assemblies of God. Yes, they're involved in the fact survey. And you're right, within that denomination, they're fairly uniform, I guess is what you're saying, right? And that has been part of the change over the last 50 years, that each denomination did not seem to be polarized within itself. There was a mix of liberal and conservative, but now the denominations themselves have become more polarized.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I don't know if you read the book, but Dean wrote a book in the mid 80s on why conservative churches are growing.
Yeah.
And you know, so having these set answers to everything, kind of forgetting the social gospels and focusing on individual salvation seems to be the popular thing now, the guarantee of having, you know, individual salvation versus social. Have you thought about this with these groups? in terms of their attitude about society and making it any better?
Absolutely. I mean, I've thought about this to the extent that I've read those kinds of books that the mainline churches tended to focus on social gospel issues, and the more evangelical churches have focused since the 1970s, certainly have focused on kind of individual salvation and having the right moral perspectives.
Do you think there's any connection between literalism among the fundamentalists and materialism? That's a form of materialism, in terms of, scripture and being a materialistic culture?
That's a great question, and I'd have to think about that. But I would say no, because I don't know that evangelical churches are more materialistic than mainline churches.
No, what I meant by materialism is shifting from the mainline are interested more in materialism from goods and acquisition of
I
wealth.
see what you're saying.
They've shifted that to religion, to where their payoff is the life hereafter, but also their interpretation, reification of scripture, right?
Yeah, and I would go back to, I don't know if you've read a lot of Max Weber, the great classical sociologist, and he would say capitalism has forced American Protestantism toward a materialistic worldview. So I think it's capitalism that's done it to every group, and not just conservative or liberal or whatever. But that's a good question.
There's a question here from Zabine Van Ness in Seattle. She says, I would be interested if we can separate out collective teaching engaged versus individual teaching. One is obedience, the other is a duty and obligation. I'm asking on behalf of the Baha'i Nightingale's campus, which she runs along with the Unity Museum in Seattle. Zabine's a very old, longtime friend of mine, so.
And the questions we've asked on the fact survey haven't asked that kind of that level of distinction. That's a good point. Collective teaching and versus individual teaching. Yeah.
And Mike, if I could add something, because Zabine and I talk a lot. She thinks of collective teaching as the core groups, core activities as collective teaching versus what we do as individuals.
Yeah.
Am I speaking correctly for you? All right.
I mean, the fact survey, we did ask questions about core activities, and that all has increased over the last 20 years. But whether whether there's also been an increase in individual teaching, as you're saying, I don't know. That's a good question. I haven't asked that. I should ask that.
Yeah. I want to pose a question to you. The American Constitution and how we were created as a country has always thought of separation of church and state being an important component of who we are as a people, as a nation, as a country. So the church is getting involved with political issues. Is that part of the problem for them losing membership? Is that a cause for the reason people are walking away from churches?
There's some research that shows that the drop off in interest among millennials, among the younger generation, is in part because churches have gotten so involved in politics, and it tends to be in a certain kind of a flavor of politics, and that has turned a lot of people off. Yeah. Chris.
There's a comment from Melanie you might want to answer.
Melanie Mozoon says, I think more Baha'is should take the moral reasoning online test put out by Haida, The Righteous Mind. It put me in a moderate category as well. Yeah. Yeah, good point. I think most Baha'is would be more moderate rather than at the extremes. Chris, you had a hand up there.
One thing that I think is interesting, there's two sociology books that have come out recently, one from a teacher at A&M, that Protestants, conservative Protestants lead in all groups in pornography.
Okay, I didn't know
his research has been based on the growth of pornography among conservative Protestants, and then also racism. So there was a book out on racism among conservatives, and then another book out on the growth of pornography.
Huh.
And I thought that was my class actually thought it was very interesting, because many of them come from conservative backgrounds.
Right. I hadn't heard that about pornography. I've seen research that connects a more evangelical worldview with racial bias. Yeah, I'll have to look that up. Maybe you can send me those citations.
Yeah, I will.
I'm looking at here. Ensan Rahim says, what is this for the public? What are you proving? Boasting for what? Are you approved by the National Spiritual Assembly doing this, or by the House of Justice? Yes, all of these surveys and our participation in fact has been approved by the National Spiritual Assembly. Every time we've put out a survey, or a Baha'i version of the survey that goes out, I send it to the National Spiritual Assembly and get their okay for it.
I'm going to send you email later tonight and ask you for a copy of the full report, if you can share it with me.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, Chris has sent you a name of the book written by Samuel Perry.
Okay.
Addicted to Lust. Wow.
All right. I'll look at that.
I'm sorry. For some reason, I find that funny.
I do too.
I hadn't heard that before. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions?
I've got one. I can't raise my hand as the host, but
okay.
So I think the data is fascinating, and I really like poring over data and trying to see what it tells us. But I guess you've sort of, you're very close to this and have been also looking at it, longitudinally over 20 years,
right.
Which makes it very fascinating. What do you think what lessons are coming out of that for a community with our aims, for example, in your mind? Like what would you advise to a community to do, to individuals to do, but also to the institutions, if you were asked?
Yeah, good question. It seems, well, I just wrote a book chapter that's going to come out pretty soon, where I looked at the fact data, and communities that consider themselves more spiritually vital and alive, that's significant, because it means that they tend to have more core activities happening. So core activities helps a community have a sense of itself as we are engaged spiritually. And the communities that have more core activities also are more engaged in their local community, whether they're having social justice events or race unity events or the equality of men and women programs or something like that. So I in some ways it not that it's my job or anything, but you know, the House of Justice's wisdom of helping Baha'is, you know, in a faith with no clergy, it seems to me the core activities have become a way to train Baha'is to develop spiritually and then translate that spiritual wisdom, that spiritual understanding into action. And the communities that have lots of core activities are also more engaged in their community. So it seems like that works. You know, if we train Baha'is to develop their spiritual selves and you know, help educate children and educate the adults in their community, then they'll be active. So there's a big correlation between doing Ruhi and children's classes and devotionals and engagement in the community. And so the data show that. And so you know, we haven't seen a huge growth. We haven't seen entry by troops, but I think we're setting the framework for the growth that's going to happen in the future. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I really appreciate your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
I'm going to send a copy of Mike's presentation to you, Nabil. You may want to share it with your fellow assembly members.
Sure.
Definitely. Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting survey for the assembly to put its arms around. And somebody from our assembly must have answered Mike's survey questions. Did Austin ever respond to your survey?
Yeah, Austin has responded, yes.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
All right.
Now, what I'm also involved in, and I got the National Spiritual Assembly's okay just a week or two ago. The FACT group is going to do another survey next year, specifically looking at what has been the impact of the pandemic on religion. So early data seem to show that people still continue to send money to their church or temple or synagogue. So monetary contributions have not dropped off very much, a little bit, but not very much. But as more churches have opened up to face-to-face worship, people aren't showing up anymore. So, so attendance had already been going down for 20 years. The fear among some is, okay, has the pandemic been yet another blow to people's interest in going to worship? Some of the early data shows whether people have lost interest or they'd rather, you know, go to church on Zoom because that was convenient, or they're afraid of going back to face-to-face large gatherings. So we're going to do another follow-up survey next year to find out. And I know my Baha'i community in League City, south of Houston, we went back to face-to-face, but then the last couple months we've been back to Zoom because the numbers keep going up, and we still participate, but it's been in a different mode. So it'll be interesting to see, my goodness, what has been the impact of a global pandemic on religious participation.
May I say something
Sure.
about that? So I'm here in New Bern, North Carolina. I don't know, we have probably 8 or 10 Baha'is. not too many. And I have a master's degree in comparative religion, so I'm interested in all of the faiths. And when I want to connect with folks in Seattle or Wilmington or someplace like that, I'm on Zoom, and it's just like, I'm on the internet now because you guys are in Austin and where my family is, which would be great, but I'm here. And I feel like it's not just the spiritual things, but it's other things as well. I have found during the pandemic and then coming out of it that people I haven't seen in years or heard from in years, they're reconnecting.
Right.
It's like, we can do this. Isn't this cool? When you wouldn't think so much maybe about like a telephone call or something. So in my observation and experience, it seems like this Zoom thing, while it's not, it's not huggy, it still connects people that might not be connected otherwise.
Yeah. I'm in a book 9 group on Sunday mornings, and we've decided to continue meeting on Zoom just because it's convenient and more people can join via Zoom than could drive across, the county. So
Mike, I'm in a study of the book of Acts, the New Testament book of Acts, and it's being conducted by a rabbi from Los Angeles and an Episcopalian minister from Austin.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's like, it's the Jewish version of what the book of Acts means. Is it an anti-Semitic book versus is it not an anti-Semitic book? That's the conversation.
Right.
It's a good opportunity to add some Baha'i viewpoints into these things.
Sure.
So, yeah. I want to make an announcement here, dear friends, and I hope you will all write this down and put it on your calendars. Our next speaker is Friday, September the 2nd, and the speaker is Rainn Wilson. Most of you probably know who Rainn Wilson is. If you don't show up and you see his face, you recognize who he is. But Rainn Wilson he has given some really detailed and very serious talks about the Baha'i faith. And it is, hopefully it's an opportunity for you to bring all your friends that are not yet Baha'is to hear a talk by Rainn Wilson. They know Dwight Schrute. Everybody knows who he is. So it would be a good opportunity. And I hope when we send out the email and the flyers, you will reach out to all your friends and invite them. The second piece that I want to share with you is I serve as this community's external affairs person, media person. So the thing that came out from the Baha'i World Center about the destruction of the homes in one of the villages in Iran, that email I forwarded to about 100 people who are not Baha'is and said, what do you think about this cruelty being inflicted? And I've sent it to the Austin American Statesman too. And if you all have not done that, please send that to all your friends. Forward it to all your friends, because at the end of that email from the World Center, it says, feel free to forward this to everybody. So please forward it to all your friends. We can't do much about the conditions in Iran, but certainly we can help build support for what is going on with the Baha'is in Iran. Mike, that was wonderful. I mean, this is a presentation that I get excited about. This is perfect. And by the way, Mike has done several other such presentations from me in Houston. So I knew what Mike does. So I'm very excited and thank you very much.
Hopefully all the tables and data wasn't too boring.
No. This is no, I loved it. I loved it.
Well, thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Yes.
You got greetings from Beijing, China.
Oh my gosh.
Cool.
On YouTube.
Oh wow.
Wow. And by the way, your daughter was online too with you.
I saw that. Yes.
Yeah. So.
She'll give me a critique back at home. So.
It was great, Mike. Thank you. And thank you.
Mike,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
all
everybody.
very
Good
much.
night. Nabil, thank you for all your
Thank
help.
you, Nabil.
Your
Good job.
technology.
Thank you, Ajit. Thank you.